a 1989 study by Hilton and Fain called "The Role of Typical Diagnosticity in Stereotype-Based Judgments" set out to determine the cause of people's judgments, assumptions, and stereotyping. What made the brain immediately assign traits and a complete backstory to some people versus others? Why were some people so quick to jump to conclusions? It was found that the less information people had about a certain subject or person, the more they began to fill in the gaps with information that was stereotypical of a general representation. Like with the example of the tennis-playing country club goer, if you only have a limited set of information, you will fill in the rest with your stereotype of a rich, preppy, affluent wasp with a white sweater knotted around their neck. We can even go further, as we surely have a detailed mental image or stereotype of this person, to prevent stereotyping and being instantly judged by others. The researchers found that simply providing details about the subject completely unrelated to the stereotype in mind diluted the stereotype and made people more likely to trust and like others. The more detail about the person, the better, even if it was completely random. When we have limited information, we assume a person is just the same as the most stereotypical representation that has those traits. The more someone's avatar gets filled out, the less able we are to fit them into those stereotypes. When we have more information about someone in any regard, we realize we can't define them by those one or two traits, and we see stereotyping and judging. What does this mean for us? There is no such thing as too much information, TMI. You can make people like you more, judge you less, and emotionally invest in you more by providing seemingly useless and nonsensical details about your life. People like to make fun of TMI, but the reality is that TMI can ultimately make you more likable. TMI is the ability to allow people to accept you. Of course, preferably you share positive or neutral information about yourself. You become less of a threat and more of a known quantity. People become less suspicious of you and are more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. By sharing seemingly trivial information about yourself, you allow people to feel like they know you, and they stop making assumptions. And again, it doesn't even matter if the details are relevant to your identity, career, non-threatening nature, or life. You can share your preference of glasses brand, your favourite colour, and perhaps where you went to school. The more information about you that is out there, the less readily people can judge and stereotype you, simply because you can't fit into singular stereotypes anymore. For example, what if we learn that the person who plays tennis and belongs to a country club was poor growing up and went to college on a tennis scholarship? Also, they drive a 20-year-old car and learn tennis from watching television, not lessons. Also, they were born in Nicaragua and reading books is their favourite activity after tennis. This probably changes your view of them. Whatever image you previously held in your head changed drastically. In fact, the additional information we've learned blows the doors off any category we could put them into. And, in a sense, that's the goal, to make it impossible for us to fit into any broad category or generalization, which allows people to see you and not a preconceived notion. With more information, people suddenly become three-dimensional. We are humanized, and we eventually realize that all humans are complex amalgamations. In reality, you really haven't done anything profound. You haven't even given any information that's important or useful. To an extent, the way we utilize this knowledge for likability is to get into the mindset of oversharing and offering unsolicited information. This will be difficult for many people, as many glide through life saying as little about themselves as possible. It can be intimidating. You may have been taught your whole life to be modest and even private. But it's really quite simple to start. For instance, if someone asks about your weekend, don't resort to answering, "Good, how about yours?" A guideline I like to use is to give 3 to 4 distinct details when answering easy questions. In this way, you'll get into the habit of giving people more information, which will make conversation flow better anyway. Here's an example of zero sharing, little information, and a high likelihood of judgment and stereotyping. "Where are you from?" "Oklahoma." "You..." If you don't know anything about a person besides the fact they are from Oklahoma, where does your mind automatically go? It goes to whatever your stereotypes about Oklahoma are. You don't know if this person was born there, raised there, or only lived there for a couple of years. You don't have the context to make a good judgment about them, and yet you do anyway. This one trait defines them in your mind. Here's an example of why giving unsolicited information can be helpful. "Where are you from?" "Oklahoma, but I was born in New York. My parents were originally from France, and I grew up visiting France frequently. I can't go much now because I have 8 dogs. Now attempt to put this person into a box. It's the same person as before, but it's nearly impossible because there is so much information about them that you simply have to take them as they are. When you know more about them, they become more humanized and interesting. Plus, it's hard to not continue a conversation after an introduction like that. The added benefit to sharing unsolicited information, and more in general, is you make it extremely easy for others to connect with you. When you spout off details about your life, it's easy for them to find common ground and know you as a person. If you divulge personal information or intimate details of your life, you'll also be appearing to take the first steps to building trust and showing vulnerability to others. The more that's out there, the more there is for people to hook onto and relate to. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with stereotypes because we use them for convenience and efficiency. However, when we use them to prematurely judge others, it becomes a weakness and a large blow to your likability. Once again, the Pygmalion effect comes into play, and we cause people to live down to our expectations of them. In 1997, in the experimental generation of interpersonal closeness, a procedure and some preliminary findings, Aron found that sharing did more than simply make you less susceptible to judgment from others. It creates emotional closeness and investment. In fact, the more intimate and invasive the information, better. He split participants into 2 groups. One group questioned each other on 36 very specific and intimate questions, including personal vulnerabilities and insecurities. The other group was tasked to ask each other only shallow small-talk questions about their everyday lives. Here are some examples of the questions used. Do you want to be famous? But for what? This tells you what a person really values or imagines themselves to be skilled at. This can reveal someone's deepest desires and fantasies. If you were able to live up to 90 and save either the mind or body of a 30-year-old, which thing would you want to save? You learn whether someone values the physical or mental more. You also learn if someone is honest or not. If you could change anything about how you were raised, what would you change? Here you gain deep insight into someone's past and history. You learn about his or her regrets and if his or her childhood was happy. You may learn some deeply personal secrets about someone. If you could wake up tomorrow with any one quality, what would that quality be? This question enables you to learn what someone wants to be and what he or she values in a person. The person you're asking this question of will always answer with the quality that matters most to him or her. Is there something that you have wanted to do for a long time? Why haven't you done it yet? People all have dreams. They also have regrets. Asking someone this lets you uncover them both. You can hear about personal challenges and hopes and extenuating circumstances in their lives. You will hear an honest appraisal about people's lives and ambitions. It's impossible to not get personal and emotional when faced with these questions. It's not something people are comfortable doing, but the participants follow directions. The participants who are tasked with asking each other sensitive and sometimes prying personal questions developed greater levels of trust, rapport, and mutual comfort with one another. They felt emotional closeness, even though they didn't know each other before the study. The other group, however, didn't develop this level of trust, confidence, and intimacy. They essentially remained at their initial level of emotional closeness. So when you share, other people stereotype and judge you less. When both parties share, feelings of mutual closeness and intimacy occur. Why does this happen on a practical level? Because while others may not have gone through the exact same events, there are always universal elements, and they can empathize with those. The more you share, the more you will inevitably find common ground with others. Share your emotions. Everyone in the world, from Americans to Austrians to Aboriginals to African bush people, share universal emotional highs and lows, even if the physical manifestation is different. This can start with talking about how happy or sad something makes you. That's all it takes to open a deeper dialogue. Share stories from your own life. Even though it doesn't feel like it, we all go through similar circumstances and struggles every day. We all brush our teeth, hate waking up, and commute to some kind of job. We all have common experiences. You have some part of your life story that others can relate to. We all remember when we learned to ride a bike, embarrassing moments in high school, or disasters in dating. Ultimately, you want to just get into the habit of talking about yourself more, and you'll reap the rewards. Where lack of social confidence comes from. A lack of social confidence, and its close cousin social anxiety, are different from most phobias or actions because you can't realistically escape the source of your fears. At some point, you're going to have to get out into the world. Most of us have to do so on a daily basis. And yet, even with repeated exposure to social situations, some still can't overcome their lack of confidence and let their anxiety continue. It seems entirely illogical that you wouldn't be able to adjust to something you encounter so frequently. But it's not a logical thing. And there is a very specific thought process that underlies it all, which reinforce harmful beliefs. British psychologists David M. Clarke and Adrian Wells devised a cognitive model of social anxiety. And the lack of social confidence, which treats the affliction as a complex process, characterized by fear and insecurity. Clarke and Wells described the typical step-by-step mental patterns of someone who is in an active social situation and when they're ruminating before or after it happens. In this way, it's frighteningly easy to see how social fears can manifest, and with just a few small tweaks, they can be infinitely worsened or brought back from the brink. They observed how disempowering thoughts began, how they are reinforced, and how they eventually begin to be part of the narrative people tell themselves. To understand this process is to understand how you ended up at this point. Aching assumptions. In the first step, before any actual interaction, socially anxious person works, so to speak, from a set of expectations and beliefs about themselves and the world they've nurtured, likely since a very young age. These assumptions float to the surface in a social environment, making them extremely difficult to navigate. They're all present in the person before an interaction occurs. Clark Wells divided these assumptions into 3 categories. Assumption 1: high standards. Socially anxious people often impose unreasonable expectations on how they should behave in a communal setting. I have to look smart, I have to be appealing, I have to sound like an exciting person, I can't be weak. These standards go way beyond having good manners. They constitute a harsh checklist of behaviours that cause a great deal of stress. Actually, these border on expectations of perfection and flawlessness. Of course, they are setting themselves up for failure with these expectations. Assumption 2. Conditional beliefs. Socially anxious people have deep concern over the outcome of their interactions with others and fear the potential fallout. If I don't speak for an extended amount of time, they'll all think I'm boring. If I say how much I dislike a certain singer, they'll think I have no taste. If I talk about things in my life, they won't like me. That's giving a lot of power to other people in the interaction. They attribute cause and effect to situations with no prior justification or evidence. Assumption 3. Unconditional negative beliefs. Low self-opinion, often imprinted from childhood, is major fuel for the socially anxious. I'm weird. Oh, I'm dull. I'm uneducated. I'm naive. The list goes on. This kind of self-talk can be incredibly tough to overcome, since it channels a belief system that's developed and cultivated over years and years. Remember the ripple effect? With these 3 assumptions at the forefront of the socially anxious person's mind, getting through a social situation can feel like a juggling act. They also need validation that they've executed their self-directives successfully. If they don't get explicit approval from others, they'll take even a neutral response as rejection. When you find someone that operates with these assumptions, you find that there is nowhere for them to go but down into a spiral of negativity, intense self-monitoring. In the second step, which occurs during interactions, a socially anxious person fears negative reactions from those they're associating with. This internal duress transforms them from a person into what Clark Wells call a social object. This means that instead of acting in a natural or unforced way, the socially anxious person watches their own behaviour in the company of others, monitoring themselves as if they were being graded for how well they do. They're trying to accomplish the impossible task of doing 2 things at once, interacting and analysing. Predictably, splitting your attention doesn't help get positive reactions from people, and usually just reinforces the fears and assumptions that drive them. It's a vicious cycle. Clark Wells declared 3 thought patterns that socially anxious people use to monitor their conduct. Thought pattern 1. If I feel anxious, I must look anxious. The socially anxious person feels like they must be an open book, and everyone around them can tell when they're going through an episode of great distress. They believe they exhibit outward displays of tensions like shaking or stammering, and the whole room can see them, similar to the spotlight effect. But in truth, An outside observer might not even see or notice the person showing such strain. They will manage to convince themselves of their own downfall in doing this, 'cause it. Thought pattern 2. Distortion of an observer's perspective. Clark Wells found that many people suffering from social phobia appear to experience spontaneously occurring images, in which they seem themselves as if viewed from an observer's perspective. But the images returned to the individual aren't ones that objective observers would necessarily have. They come back as gross caricatures of themselves that represent their internal fears. For example, somebody who perceives themselves as overweight might imagine everyone who looks at them sees an elephant. A person who considers themselves emotionally weak might see a vision of themselves as a frail, rickety convalescent. Thought pattern 3. Fear, distort and repeat. Clark Wells defined the third step as a felt sense. Essentially, it means multiplying the fears and distortions of the first 2 thought patterns until they become a firm part of one's self-belief. This generates and solidifies the negative self-perception of a socially anxious person. Safety behaviours. Armed with a boatload of mini-phobias and self-monitoring abilities, in the third step, the socially anxious person often develops a catalogue of behaviours that will protect them from breakdown in a social situation. These are safety behaviours. Exterior behaviours that serve to defend a socially anxious person from what they perceive as potential threats. They're psychological soothers that help them take their mind off their uneasiness or prevent them from taking hold. You might perceive them more clearly by their more widespread named defence mechanisms. Again, picture someone who is insecure of their stature, who buys a huge truck to attempt to overcompensate and feel big. They follow these guidelines to the letter, and if they emerge unscathed from a certain social situation, they think it's because they were careful and guarded, not because they were never in any danger to begin with, as is often the case. Any times a person will deploy safety behaviours in a sort of package, since their anxieties often come from a diverse number of multiple sources and forms. The multiple actions form a kind of playbook, a series of checked behaviours to be dispatched at various points in the social setting. For example, take someone who is utterly terrified of looking stupid. They fear their alleged stupidity will manifest itself in various ways. I'll sound stupid when I talk. To combat this fear, their safety behaviour might be to aggressively search for interesting topics at home to bring up in conversation, or continually turn the topic back to them and their accomplishments. Charming. They'll make fun of me. The person might try to look imposing or tough in a forced way. They'll know I don't understand what they're talking about. To cover this up, they'll pretend to nod along with everything that is said, and never admit that they don't know something. Clark Wells noted that some of these safety behaviours are, in fact, self-defeating. By over-executing them, a person could cause the very symptom or blunder they're trying to avoid. Indeed, even though the behaviours are intended to protect, they're almost always dead giveaways for overcompensation and a lack of confidence. The intense amount of self-monitoring that accompanies safety behaviours can also start a self-aware loop of attention that could draw the person more inward and out of a normal social situation. And being hyper-aware of their anxieties and appearance can also make others notice that something's off. In this sense, the social phobic makes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're so aware of their shortcomings and criticism that they cause them. Is reading social cues. In the fourth step, from an accumulation of all the previous steps, The socially anxious person tends to view their current situation and everyone around them in a negative light. That means they're likely to misread the reactions of other people as rejections or criticism, even if they're neutral. For example, if someone they're telling a story to laughs because they said something funny, they might instead interpret the laughter as mocking or rude. Any suffering from social anxiety of set-in-stone ideas about how people should act in social situations and quickly notice when someone falls short of those usually unspoken standards. They judge even the most neutral or vague reactions as negative responses. The person telling the funny story, for example, might think their listener should be focused on them with full eye contact. If whoever they're speaking to looks away for a second or exhibits facial reaction, they consider it a message of disapproval. Sadly, they are viewing everything through a negative filter, so even the best of intentions can and will be interpreted to be malicious and reason for low confidence. These are cognitive distortions, which we will cover in greater depth in the next chapter. Analysing before after social situations. In the final step and the completion of the cycle, the social phobic confidence challenged tend to agonise and ruminate about social situations, even when they're not actively in them at the moment. The lead up to a social event can stir up great anxiety for a social phobic. They might spend a considerable amount of time worrying about what might transpire down to the last insignificant detail. They'll remember previous encounters that were disappointing or negative to them. They'll imagine they'll fail spectacularly in the upcoming event. They'll forecast being dismissed or spurned by others in the group. This is before they've even put their shoes on to leave. After the event is over, the social phobic will feel at least some relief from their anxiety since they're out of the stressful situation. Indeed, it will feel something like escaping from a lion's den. But it won't be long until the post-mortem starts. The social phobic goes back over every interaction they had at the event, recalling their heightened anxiety, small telling details that get set in their memory and filtering every exchange and occurrence through their negative self-opinions. They'll classify the event among all the other occasions in which they felt they failed. Safe harbour. The first aspect about reforming your toxic habits is to realise that you might actually be making people feel unsafe and uncomfortable yourself. That is a startling realisation, but it happens more than we think in daily life. For instance, picture a co-worker who doesn't take criticism very well and you feel the need to walk on eggshells around them. Or consider someone who cannot regulate or manage their own emotions and appears to randomly burst into tears on a consistent basis. Or even someone who judges others and constantly calls them stupid behind their backs. How do you feel being around this kind of energy? It's not a stretch to say that you'd simply start avoiding these folks. At the root, people just need to feel like they can be themselves around you, and that they have nothing to fear and no reason to have their guards up. For instance, do people feel like they can be themselves next to a wild bear? No, they will be tense and uncomfortable because there is a sense of unpredictability and imminent danger. People feel like they can be themselves next to a fuzzy white bunny rabbit. The lowest hanging fruit for us to reform is to start with feelings of negativity and how you can better cope with them so people can feel that you are predictably safe like the white bunny rabbit. We all feel negative emotions, but the difference between someone who creates safety and someone who does not is how we deal with these emotions. Whatever the circumstances, if you are outwardly angry, sullen, or irritable, people will avoid you in the fear that they will be your next target. No one seeks out that kind of energy. especially if it happens on a consistent basis. People won't feel comfortable being themselves around you if you are constantly upset, overly critical, hateful, or volatile. This isn't about hiding your emotions, or even faking them. But if our goal is making people feel comfortable around us, you can't be ticking time bomb that people won't feel comfortable around because they don't know when you will blow up. You have to learn to manage your negative emotions in a way that you can still express yourself, but not send people running for shelter. People have to know that whatever happens to you stays with you and you won't punish others for something they were not involved in. It begins simply enough. Keep your cool whenever negativity occurs. The situation is likely tense enough that you shouldn't be making it worse by injecting your own emotions into it. Don't shoot the messenger. And understand that a small bit of negativity can go a long way in how people feel about you. Don't take out your negative feelings like anger, jealousy, sullenness, or resentment on others. Feel them and express them, but the difference is that you shouldn't allow them to affect how you interact with others in any way. You want to minimize the negative emotions you project because your feelings are not anyone else's problem. If you are in a poor mood, don't act in a way that puts others into the same mood. This is less of an interpersonal skill than an emotional management skill. The easiest way to minimize these feelings is to let go of them. Why can two people experience the exact same calamity and yet one recovers quickly and the other is stuck in frustration? It's an attachment and decision to fixate on an outcome that is not to their liking instead of asking, and now what? And understanding that the only path is forward. Let go of thoughts that hurt you. Because when you think negative thoughts, you can't help but fixate and you lower your own mood. Focus on what is good in life and what you are grateful for. Everyone faces hardships in life, yet some people are still lovable and a joy to be around when they're at their lowest moments. Obviously, this is a rather large topic that deserves a few books on its own. But for our purposes, just understand that people need to feel safe around you. In this way, you also create a feeling that others can be safe in expressing their negativity with you. And if we can assume that of the world's topics are negative by nature, this opens up a whole range of topics and emotions that people can explore with you. Again, of course, bad events will have a negative effect on you. It is naive to assume that you won't ever be hurt or disturbed by the bad things that can happen in life. Feel your emotions and express them. But don't have them affect your interactions or take your emotions out on others. Negative emotion management makes people feel safe around you and feel confident that you aren't going to attack. Over time, it makes you predictable in a good way, where people know they can expect only positivity from you and that you are someone they can turn to for support and cheer. Safety and comfort are the first steps to rapport and friendship. Becoming assertive the right way. All of the people mentioned in this chapter are examples of real people with real hurt feelings. Trying to modify another adult's behaviour is probably not going to work. Hoping they can suddenly peer into your mind is also likely a recipe for failure. Being passive-aggressive is going to make the problems these people face worse instead of better. Learning to ask for what you want is key. There is an easy fix to these disruptions in relationships. It is as simple as opening your mouth and saying out loud what you want. Simple statements like, I would like you to wash the dishes while I help the kids with their homework, or I would like to spend some time alone with you. Let's get a sitter and plan a night out. Actually work the vast majority of the time. Here are some guidelines to help you out with an ask in any situation. 1. Ask and then stop talking. Don't fill the silence after your assertive request that you perceive to be gaping and awkward. That's where it's too easy for us to hedge and say things like, only if you want, or but I could go either way. It's up to you. Really, it's in this moment of weakness that most of us fail, even when we have a strong start. Although this is the first step, this is the biggest obstacle most of us have to overcome. This is where we imagine an ask might easily turn into a confrontation or threat. If it doesn't rise to that extent, at the very least there'll be an untold amount of tension and discomfort here. That's true. But once you're over this hurdle, you'll find that the rest of assertiveness is just learning phrases to use. Just 3 seconds of sweaty palm sit between you and what you want. In the course of those 3 seconds, all of the damaging and toxic beliefs we have rushed toward us, including their blue-ified versions, just try to picture it as a roller coaster, with a definitive end, all within safe guidelines to prevent a fantastic crash. To create a win-win. In a Psychology Today piece, psychologist Susan Krauss-Whitbourne suggests that when asking for something, it is crucial to consider the person we are asking. Are their needs being considered? How can this request benefit them? Is this a good time to make such a request? If the tables were turned, how would I view this request? Basically, how can you make your ask more of a win-win situation? At least in framing. Hey, if you're going to assert yourself, you can at least make it seem like you're barely making a request. For example, someone in the middle of a stressful personal ordeal might not feel that she can take on another project at work. Hinting around that she should take on an intern is likely to be ignored. However, a direct conversation about how an intern could be utilized to reduce some of her daily tasks and allow her to focus on something more important to her might allow her to see an opportunity to focus on work she loves while allowing someone else to manage some of her day-to-day grunt work. Assertiveness can be made much more palatable if you just take into account what the other person wants to feel and think. Are you really making a request if the other person stands to benefit as well? It sure feels better. Plus, it's easier to approach and engage someone when you feel that you're offering something as well, versus making an imposition on them. 3. Make it easy. Likewise, assertiveness can flow when you make your requests convenient and easy. If you need to meet face-to-face, do it at their office, on their break, or at their favourite lunch spot. Do not expect people to go out of their way in order for you to request a favour. Instead of your natural inclination to hedge with, "Can we meet?" Only if you have time you can substitute it with, "Can we meet? Lunch is on me at your favourite sandwich place." The key here is to make your ask smaller than it needs to be, so it will be better received and easier to squeeze out. 4. Offer clear-cut options. If you're asking someone to help with charity fundraiser, I have options they can choose from. For instance, if you're asking for someone to watch your dog, offer to take him to their place or let them stay at your place and use your building's gym facilities while you're out of town. Also, make sure they have a way to say no without feeling guilty in case they cannot or do not want to do what you have asked. It may be a great charity, but they might have other causes they support. They might love your dog, but do not want the responsibility of caring for a pet. In other words, give them an array of options and don't force them into an awkward situation where they might want to deny you, but don't feel that they can. This runs along the same theme from earlier points of letting your expectations be known. This has the added benefit of being psychologically easier for you to approach with. When you assert yourself, you only hold yourself back by cloaking it in ambiguity or a vague request that leaves it up to you, or whatever you want. 5. Be direct. Whitbourne also notes the importance of asking for one thing when the real intention is something else. Having an ulterior motive is hard to hide. Being direct and honest about what you want and why you want it allows for effective communication. It might be difficult to imagine why a person would express a desire without being honest about it, but it does happen. Anyone who owns a pickup truck knows what it's like to be called upon to first catch up and then magically to help a friend move a couple of things. It starts with a sofa and then, next thing you know, it's also a dozen boxes, a refrigerator and a bike. This is going to feel like a covert operation. It's dishonest and is going to make the owner of the truck feel used or set up. It's because there was a guise of friendship and wanting to catch up, which was quickly discarded as a front. Contrast this to being direct and straightforward about your request. There is greater chance of being refused. This is what we innately want to prevent and avoid, but when it is accepted on its merits and without bitterness or resentment. A dishonest request will lead to far worse feelings in the long run than an honest request. 6. Be specific. When people make general requests, imagine how that sounds to the recipient of the request. It's basically open-ended, and they aren't completely sure of what they will be agreeing and obligating themselves to. Can you help out with the bake sale? Is a vague, scary request that you should rightfully not assert. Can you bring cupcakes to the bake sale and man the table for 1 hour? Is something that is specific, easier to say yes to, and will get a more positive and thoughtful reaction as opposed to a blanket no. In making requests, you have to combine common sense and strategy. Understand that people are busy and don't want to commit to more than they can handle. 7. Oh, and if someone says no, you better not pout. If you pout and get upset when someone turns down what you perceive to be a reasonable request, you go on people's blacklists. Small percentage of people might cave in once they see you've become upset. But pouting is actually a subtle form of emotional blackmail, like we talked about earlier. The self-punisher's threat, if I don't get what I want from you, I will make myself suffer. It brings out a feeling that you are entitled. But for the rest of us, no one wants to be around someone who sulks around when things do not go as planned. People who act entitled do not win friends. In fact, people who feel and act resentful seem petty, immature and whiny rather than mature and responsible. Being assertive does not mean always getting your way, but when you take time to articulate reasonable requests, chances are good that they will be met. Sometimes the timing is off or other factors need to be considered, but that is not a reason to ruminate over a disappointing outcome. When things do not work out, it is easy to feel sorry for yourself. That can lower your self-esteem and lead to feelings of depression. In fact, some people would even start to question whether or not they should have asserted themselves in the first place. In the end, one of the best ways to improve assertiveness is to consider what you want in a particular situation, decide the best time and place to make your requests known, speak up for yourself, and then negotiate for a solution that meets the needs of all of those involved. In that way, you make assertiveness seem harmless and burdenless.